Yesterday I released a video about the Articles of Confederation, delving into why they had failed and had to be replaced, how we might ensure they remain in place, and a bunch of branching potentials about how this may impact the world going forward. But I barely explored concrete timelines. So I asked some other alternate historians to create some, and Rewriting History and LoreDad responded. And I myself will add more detail to a timeline I explored yesterday. There will also be a link to a Google Doc in the description where you can vote for your favorite out of these timelines. Now, we have decided to just have some fun with the concept. These are very much not attempts to stick to the most plausible timelines, as I already tried to do that yesterday. Now, if you've already watched yesterday's video, you should skip to the time on screen now to watch the first timeline by Rewriting History. If you haven't, a quick summary on the concept. While fighting the British, the concept of a United States was very fragile, far removed from the unified state of the day, and much closer to an alliance of 13 rebelling colonies. To formalize cooperation, they ratified the Articles of Confederation, which basically created a loose confederation. The power of the federal government was extremely limited. It couldn't even raise taxes, being forced to rely on payments from the individual states. The government had no way to force states to listen to them, and reform and governance was very difficult, as 9 out of 13 states were needed to agree even on minor matters, while full unanimity was needed for major decisions. Financial issues swiftly threatened to become ruinous for the government, as they were in heavy debt to European lenders without any means of paying them back. Even worse, generous pensions were promised to former soldiers, and the economy was sluggish, weakened by war and uncertainty, but also because of not just European, but also interstate economic barriers being put up. The army and navy were both disbanded to save money, and state militias had to be relied on. When a large-scale anti-government rebellion broke out in Massachusetts, the federal government itself could do nothing to counter it. For all those reasons and more, the Constitutional Convention was called, and after a lot of debate on competing visions of the state that was to be built, the Constitution, still in place today, was created. If we want to ensure that the Articles aren't replaced, it is this convention that we need to sabotage. Unfortunately, this is simultaneously very plausible and very difficult. This specific convention failing because of disagreements between the founding fathers is easy enough. Even historically, several states left or failed to show up at all, and it was the vote of a single Massachusetts delegate which allowed the grand compromise that led to the Constitution pass. Thus, the failure of this convention, either because of more disagreements or some other changes, like Washington dying earlier and failing to rally the nation, are far from impossible. And indeed, it is the point of departure most of us will follow today. But the difficulty lies in that most realistically, even if this constitutional convention fails, another one could easily succeed later on. Whether months or even years down the line, an alternate constitution would likely be written anyways. There was a real push from most states and most founding fathers to make the Union work. To have them all just bow their heads and give up on unity is indeed a tall order, but regardless, is the assumption we are going to make today. With that, let's dive into the actual scenarios. Once more, these are meant to largely be story-based alternate histories, having fun with the concept of a disunited States of America, not necessarily our thoughts on what is most realistic. That said, I give the floor to Rewriting History with the first scenario of the day.
So, you already know why the Articles of Confederation were a terrible first constitution, as the federal government couldn't trace a separate army, taxes, treaties, trade and so on. But if it was kept anyways, it likely makes the 13 colonies split up and become independent countries, rather than a whole united country that would later dominate the world. This is how the story would go. We begin in the year of 1781, when the American Revolutionary War is still ongoing, and just after the Articles of Confederation were adopted thanks to Maryland finally agreeing to join the Union, after stalling the negotiations for 3 years. Why was this, you may ask? Well, let us just go ask them. Hey, this is unfair, let me tell you why. Even if we win the Revolutionary Wars, Maryland is in a tough position. This is because all colonies were supposed to expand west until we reach the Pacific Ocean. But we don't have anywhere to expand, all because of Virginia. Screw this. Now this may seem like a petty issue, but this is actually a big deal, hence the western border of these colonies were not properly defined. After America gained their independence is when this became a big problem. Virginia had claimed parts of southwest Pennsylvania, which prevented Maryland from expanding westwards. The chaos didn't stop there, and I must warn you that the border gore is actually insane. Connecticut continued their claim westwards and claimed northern Pennsylvania all the way up to the west, despite having no land connection there. In late December 1782, Congress ended Connecticut's claim to northern Pennsylvania, but they still continued to claim the rest, until September 1786, when they gave up most of their western lands to the federal government, but continued to claim this part of West Pennsylvania until 1800, when it was given to the Northwest Territory. This even caused the Panamite-Yankee Wars, which were 3 different wars over northeastern Pennsylvania between the two sides. More interestingly, the first 2 wars were fought during the American War of Independence. So this just goes to show how each state was looking after themselves, and that coordination was non-existent during the Articles of Confederation. Until 1785, Massachusetts continued to claim these parts of Michigan and Wyoming, which is crazy border gore, but also this tiny part that could have given Pennsylvania access to the Great Lakes, called the Erie Triangle. Pennsylvania eventually bought this land from the federal government in 1792. Further, until December 1786, Massachusetts also claimed this part of New York. In 1787, South Carolina ceded their western claims in favor of Georgia, ending some minor border gore. Now this is really important, because with the Articles of Confederation never being replaced by the American Constitution, all of these states would become de facto independent. I mean, Vermont technically became a state in 1791, but were acting independently since 1777, which is 14 years in total. Vermont was also claiming parts of their neighboring states, namely the East Union from New Hampshire and West Union from New York, where they tried to separate times to annex these territories, once in 1778 and another time in 1781, a decade before they officially became a state, as they were still technically part of New York. Now most of these issues were resolved during the Confederation period, which is the time when the United States was ruled by the Articles of Confederation, hence the name. We can assume that some of these border issues would be still resolved in this alternate history, but not all of them, which creates further friction between these states and mutual hatred. There is still no central government, so each state would have their own armies, laws and currencies, but most importantly in Congress, each state would have just one congressman regardless of population. This creates the obvious problem of Georgia, with a population of 23,000 people, having the same voting power as Virginia with a population of 447,000 people, or about 19 times higher than that of Georgia. What we can see is the larger states would want to reform the Articles of Confederation, while the smaller states would benefit from the Articles due to them having disproportionately more representation. In 1788, when the new American Constitution is proposed, I would have as a point of divergence for the Articles of Confederation to continue is for these states to vote against it. Historically, 9 out of the 13 states voted in favor, so it was adopted. Virginia, New York, North Carolina and Rhode Island voted against it, but in this alternate history I would have more states to oppose it, especially the smaller states that would want to keep the status quo, which benefits them more. We can see Georgia and Vermont to oppose it, which would give the no faction the majority, meaning that America never adopts their current constitution. Perhaps either Massachusetts or Connecticut opposes it as well, due to their claims that I stated earlier. In this new constitution, they would have to give up these lands to the federal government, which would create new states, so they may refuse to do that. The reason why is because the whole point of the American Revolution was to get rid of the British Parliament, and how they could set taxes unrestricted, which made the colonies want to become independent and set taxes on their own. This is why many states in this alternate history wouldn't be in favor of replacing the British Parliament with an American one. Here is yet another problem. Historically the new constitution was adopted, but you may ask why weren't the Articles of Confederation just amended after the Revolutionary Wars? This is because any constitutional changes had to be ratified by all 13 colonies unanimously agreeing, which is impossible to happen in practice, hence why it was easier for the new constitution to be adopted with a vote of 9 to 13. In this alternate history, this wouldn't happen, so we're stuck with articles that are borderline impossible to amend. In the 1780s and 90s, I think the two factions would emerge, those of the Unionists or Liberals, wishing to introduce the new American Constitution that had failed to pass, and those of the Federalists or Conservatives, who would want to keep the Articles of Confederation. Generally, the small states benefit from the Articles, while the big ones do not, so here are roughly how these lines are drawn. In the 1780s, the tensions would be still rising. As each state is acting more so as an independent country, they would start raising taxes on each other, causing a trade war. Historically, New York placed heavy tariffs on New Jersey, and since New Jersey didn't have a major port of their own, they were forced to pay these tariffs, but also they retaliated with tariffs of their own. Connecticut and Massachusetts did something similar, more so inspired by protectionism. Here in this alternate history we can see these tariffs and the subsequent trade war to be between the Unionists and the Federalists. Another problem would become one of currency, as each state would have their own, which became a problem since merchants often refused to take different state currencies, making cross-border trade not too common, leading to most states to exist in a vacuum, so the United States of America existed just on paper. I mean, heck, there is no president yet, as George Washington became the first president after the adoption of the first constitution, all of which is not the case here. I think that you already know what I'm about to say. There would be an American Civil War in the 1790s, regarding the future of the country, with one side wanting to adopt the American Constitution and another wanting the Articles to remain. Maine was part of Massachusetts until 1820, so I can see them to rebel and to side with the Unionists, while Tennessee would do the same, as both would want to become states. But Massachusetts and North Carolina wouldn't agree to this, because this would result in them getting less votes in Congress, as each state would have one vote regardless of population. The smaller states wouldn't want the creation of new states, as it means that they would lose some political leverage. Now the Unionists would have a population of 1,223,000 people, while the Federalists have 1,409,000 people, so a slight edge, making this a very even fight regarding America's future. If the Unionists are victorious, then we return mostly to our history with the adoption of the American Constitution, but there would be some major changes, like George Washington likely not being president. As this war would start in the 1790s, George Washington is unlikely to become president literally 10 years after winning the Revolutionary Wars, and historically he didn't even want to be the president in the first place. If the Unionists win, then America is drastically altered. There may not be a constitutional amendment where a president can only serve 2 terms, for example. Basically, America becomes like historically but slightly altered, yet it eventually expands, then expands some more, and more, and more, and then a random Bulgarian speaks in English because of America being strong and large. However, if the Federalists win, neither of these would be the case, and then the scenario becomes more interesting. The Articles are here to stay, and we could see Connecticut to expand their claimed territories, same for Massachusetts, Vermont and Maryland, creating for these disgusting state borders. By the way, Britain and Spain would take the time to fix their borders with the US in their favor, as there were some border disputes. Now with the 1800s, with the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, the United States doesn't purchase Louisiana from France. This was historically done by the federal government, and here with the conservatives winning, there is practically no federal government. Technically, a separate state can purchase it for themselves, if they can afford the asking price of $15 million, but there would become 2 main problems. The first one is that neither state can actually afford it, but even if they could, then all the other states would push their claims westwards, possibly leading to another war. The second problem is that France wouldn't want to sell it to an American state. France sold it because they needed money to fight the British, and as each American state would have their own worthless currency, it wouldn't be of any use to France. I can see the British to seize French Louisiana and eventually for the Canadians to get it. Spain would still lose Mexico, which would become independent, and likely would keep plenty of their territory, as the US wouldn't invade them. The problem for America is that they cannot expand in any way, due to the new territories, if there are any, having to be added to already existing states, rather than for new ones to be created. Originally, the Articles were based on Switzerland, which worked well for the Swiss, since they wanted to be neutral and not an expansionist power, but the US became that unwillingly, drastically being worse off than today. Alaska is likely kept by Russia as a result of that, or hey, maybe Liechtenstein gets it instead, who knows. What I do know is that with the US being weaker and not really be able to expand, it unsurprisingly results in Canada and Mexico to fill in the power vacuum and become stronger and larger themselves.
Thank you, Rewriting History. Now, on to the second scenario, by none other than LoreDad.
The Constitutional Convention begins, but without the beloved George Washington, the symbol of unity and bravery that the American Revolution had rallied behind had unfortunately passed away before the convention could begin. Founding fathers and state representatives had all put their ideas forward, but the ultimate conclusion, the adoption of the Connecticut Compromise, would never come to fruition. Instead, those who supported the New Jersey Plan and the Virginia Plan would bitterly oppose each other until the convention had failed. But a radical speech by Alexander Hamilton that would have been glossed over in our history would become semi-prophetic in this alternate timeline, where the outspoken advocate of centralization would be the best chance that the young nation the United States could have to reach anywhere close to the heights of our timeline's USA. Will Hamilton rise to the occasion to lead the United States in this crisis? How would the Articles of Confederation contribute to the decline and rise of the USA? Welcome to my story, Imperator Hamilton. After the failed convention, Hamilton would return to his home in New York, where he would expand on his ideas for a new plan. This hypothetical New York plan would be a significant departure not only from the New Jersey and Virginia plans, but the compromise that established the governmental structure of the United States today. In our timeline, during the convention, Hamilton had proposed several radical governmental ideas that would make the average liberty lover faint. Hamilton's ideas would be harshly criticized, especially as word would travel to the South. However, as time went on, more and more would begin to be swayed by his proposals. With the continued existence of the Articles of Confederation, regional revolts like Shays' Rebellion would not be easily quelled. The rural farmers who had been unable to pay their taxes would revolt, and the New Hampshire government in our timeline had resorted to semi-legal mercenaries to suppress them. However, with each state having similar problems, the revolt would spread, escalating the rebellion instead of having it be properly quelled. The result of this escalation of the revolt had meant that it spread to New York. Hamilton, using his prestige as a founding father, would manage to gain control of the New York militia and contain this rebellion. But due to the Articles, he could not pass state boundaries in his campaign. Hamilton would need to negotiate with the state leaders in order to allow his passage. But now that Hamilton had an army backing him, he had the ability to start negotiating support for his movement in exchange for his assistance in quelling the rebellions. Due to their lack of capability to suppress their own revolt, they would all acquiesce to Hamilton's bargain. Shays' Rebellion would be quelled, but now Hamilton had a position of influence in the North that would allow for his political ideas to gain far more footing. While each state had sworn fealty to the Congress of the Confederation, the power of Congress was extremely limited. The 13 states that made up the Confederation were truly independent, not equal parts of a greater whole like we know of today. They had conflicting claims, different currencies, and without the Constitution, nothing was stopping these states from enforcing tariffs or embargoing each other. It should be no surprise that the British had barely respected the independence of the United States, and despite the Treaty of Paris guaranteeing the United States these territories, they were barely able to properly distribute the lands between themselves, let alone settle and integrate them. That's why in our timeline, the British and Spanish had supported local natives in order to halt the USA's expansion. While Hamilton may have gained local allies, he would not be able to convince the entirety of the Confederation to adopt his radical ideas. So while the British may fear a truly United States, they would be pleased to know that the young republic would stagnate. In our timeline, the British had anticipated the potential that the American Republic could collapse, and in that event, they could be potentially reconquered. For this reason, the British continued to garrison and supply 8 forts that were legally American territory, 4 of them within New York State, dangerously close to New York City, but the Congress of the Confederation had met. After the French revolutionaries had managed to consistently defeat their enemies in open combat, the British would sign the Jay Treaty, which had, as well as many other stipulations, ensured the British would withdraw from these fortifications. This treaty would normalize US-British relations, but would anger the revolutionary French and the Democratic Republicans, who saw it as a sellout. However, in this timeline, the Jay Treaty could never be signed, forcing any attempts to unite the country with a new constitution to await for a proper opportunity, lest the British intervene. The perfect opportunity would come when the French Revolution began. Seeing as the British were preoccupied, Hamilton would call in all of his favorites in the northern states to encourage the Continental Congress to convene for a second constitutional convention in 1973. While the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan would both be recommended again, with some adjustments, Hamilton's political and military power base would allow for him to push forward his own New York plan, which would advocate for radical ideas such as the head of government and the Senate to be in office for life, and the Governor General would have extreme powers. Most relevant to this story would be the ability to supersede state law. While there was certainly room for compromise, there was no way any of the southern slave states would agree to any of the stipulations of the New York plan. Thus, the southern states would create their own federation in the South, with the majority of the states that supported the Virginia plan being in the South and the remaining northern states who had been coerced to become advocates of the New York plan. A compromise between the New Jersey and New York plans becomes the new Constitution of the United States. And because this constitution would ensure the head of government is appointed by state representatives, they would all unanimously appoint their new head of government to be Hamilton. And his first objective would be to quell the insurgency in the South. In a strange twist of fate, the American Civil War of 1861 would happen 70 years early, and just like our history, the primary talking point in the South would be states' rights. Due to this frame of mind, it's extremely possible that both the Spanish and British would support the Southern Confederation. In our timeline, Vermont was not admitted into the United States before the Constitutional Convention. This is because New York State had claimed the entirety of their territory, and therefore did not acknowledge their statehood. It's for this reason that naturally, the Union of America would effectively occupy Vermont, with the intent to annex it into the New York State. However, there would be 2 garrisoned British forts in the region, making any conflict there one with the British Empire. The way this conflict would resolve would define the fate of the United States. Given Hamilton's personal ideologies and admiration of Britain, he would sign a treaty similar to the Jay Treaty, where the British would cede forts that they had continued to control in exchange for concessions, including the assurances of neutrality in the British-French conflicts. Therefore, the American Union would avoid escalation from Britain and would destroy the Southern Confederation, truly uniting America. As a result, this America is far different than ours. Instead of being a true republic, an entrenched aristocratic class would be formed, still democratic at the county level, but with an extremely strong and elite executive. As time would go on, Hamilton's authoritarianism would be loathed by many, but the prestige of uniting the nation and preserving its sovereignty would lead to him being revered by all Americans, potentially to the extent of Washington in our timeline. However, unlike Washington, Hamilton will be the leader of the United States for a far longer period of time, with this alternate constitution having extremely long terms and no restrictions on re-election. Hamilton would have negotiated with the British to not align with France during the First Coalition War, but Napoleon's rise to authoritarian leadership would sway him to become a French ally due to the similarities of their governments and ideologies. This would lead to the sale of Louisiana, an alliance with the French, and the unironic consideration of Hamilton becoming Emperor of America after Napoleon would crown himself Emperor of France. This would lead to an earlier war of 1812, where the Americans would join the French as an ally in the coalition wars after the Third and beyond. However, the fate of America is far more difficult to consider, given how far beyond the original timeline we are. Would Hamilton truly consider crowning himself Emperor of America? Would the American people truly allow for their liberties to be continuously stifled by this aristocratic America? What would America look like if Napoleon and Hamilton succeeded or failed in both of their wars? I hope that one day I'll be able to examine this timeline more, but we're out of time. Thank you to everyone for having me on for this contest, and may the best timeline win.
Thank you, LoreDad. That only leaves my timeline, in which I try to explore a version of North American history as may have been predicted by a British elite in 1783. It is 1783, and the Americans have done the impossible. They have defeated the British Empire. New York City is jubilant, but London is suspiciously stoic. They do not panic. For almost a century ago, they had their own Republican experiment following a civil war. It swiftly descended into dictatorship and chaos before the monarchy returned to restore order. The conclusion reached by many British intellectuals was simple. Sure, limits on the power of monarchy were as old as Magna Carta, but republicanism was a step too far. The British slept easy, knowing that it was a matter of time before the Americans would beg for the return of George III. Already a few years after independence, it was rather difficult to counter such concepts. Diplomatic infighting between the states had already begun. The economy was in ruins, debt was spiraling, and revolts were breaking out. The Founding Fathers hosted several constitutional conventions, only for each to end up in disaster. The Republican experiment had already all but failed. The Americans were just too proud to admit it yet. Despite the French Revolution taking up most of Britain's attention, a side eye remained steadily fixed on their former colonies. A mixed foreign policy was established. Positive relations sought with the States, but also American sailors being impressed into the British Navy and British aid finding their way to various native groups. Most notably though, London was interested in a developing crisis in the northeast, as New York openly proclaimed their claim to Vermont, threatening to abandon the United States if this claim was not respected. Of course, the Foreign Office was more than happy to confirm that indeed, George III had rightfully granted the region to New York. In 1800, right after the passing of George Washington, New York indeed invaded, an act we now recognize as practically destroying the United States. Congress descended into infighting, as quite simply, there was no procedure to deal with this. New York could veto practically any legislation, and there was no way of actually evicting them from the Union unless they voluntarily left. Of course, without an army, it is doubtful what the federal government could have even done. It was up to the individual states to decide who they wanted to support. The New England states swiftly backed Vermont and began working on a new union to coordinate their war effort. Worried about the rise of New York as a competitor, Virginia also declared their support. Yet, the Central Atlantic states, reliant on New York ports, refused to let Virginian soldiers through. The American Civil War had begun, and Britain was more than willing to provide weapons to either side to prolong the struggle. Having struck unexpectedly, New York took the early initiative, while the various New England states struggled to coordinate their forces and disagreed over how to conduct the war. It was very clear why New York had struck now, as a unifying figure in the form of Washington would have greatly hindered their war effort. It was also soon noted that New York had significant artillery forces and controlled some rather impressive ships, while most states had practically disbanded their navies. It didn't take long to figure out where those might have come from. After a decisive battle, New York secured their victory, and in doing so, cemented American disunity. Vermont was annexed, and New England all but left the United States, while Britain pressed for disputed territories in the north. The open secret was practically out. New York had made a deal with the devil. They now established themselves as the primary trading hub with Europe. Importantly, completely embargoing New England trade through their territory, making the region increasingly reliant on New York and Britain. The situation for the Americans was bad, but it would soon get worse. Yet more debates on a closer union had begun following New York's invasion, but progress at righting it had been very slow. Now, new problems were manifesting too. The natives of the Northwest seemed to be organizing, but also, settlers west of the Appalachian Mountains were starting to grow restless, calling for independence themselves, and even petitioning Spain and Britain for aid, which both were very willing to provide. Before long, a full-blown guerrilla war was raging in the region, silently supported by the European powers. Militarily, Virginia and North Carolina seemed very successful, but the war was very costly, and a simultaneous war launched by Tecumseh in the Northwest, as well as the 5 tribes of the South, were threatening to overwhelm the American states. Virginia was the first to recognize that if this was the cost of expansion west, then they no longer had any interest. They signed a treaty allowing Kentucky to break free, and abandoned their oversight over the Northwest Territory. And aside from Pennsylvania taking over some settled parts of Ohio, a British-aligned Native Confederacy was established. Soon after, Tennessee broke away too, and Spain established their own native ally in the south. The failure of the United States was now on full display, and the remaining states in the now practically defunct Articles of Confederation finally wrote a new constitution. The southern states were the first to join together, but soon they convinced Maryland and Pennsylvania too. Yet, only including a minority of 6 of the original 13 states, the United States passed fully into history. In the decades that followed, French Louisiana, which Napoleon had reacquired, was officially seized by the British, while New England began taking the first steps towards reintegration into the British network, out of pure economic necessity. The southern states pretended to stand proud, but it was clear they were a desperate defensive pact only, not some grand, hidden future superpower. Judging by Cromwell's dictatorship, the anarchy of the United States, Napoleon's corruption of the French Revolution, and the ascendancy of the British, perhaps it is indeed true that republicanism was destined to fail. With that, we have covered all the timelines, and in the description you will find a Google Doc on which you can vote for your favorite. Also, don't forget to subscribe to LoreDad and Rewriting History, especially since you can expect LoreDad to host the next alternate history collaboration. So, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, I'm sure the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.